All right. We are live there. So I will keep that open. And all right, good. So if you guys can hear me, let me know. I got to actually move, so I will keep in that microphone and get it out of the way. Perfect. And I'm in. All right, good.
This is live picture only, or
if you guys can hear me, let me know.
Audio.
Sorry, say that one more time.
Is the live portion just audio, or is it also picture?
Picture too. Although that's kind of one of the fascinating things coming up in the future is that it's also audio is a live thing now. It wasn't that way like a year ago, in the same sense. Like now there's Clubhouse, all these things. So let me put this up. There we go. So welcome everybody to this. I would like to welcome Noah Kadner to this show, to what we do here at Vertex School. And you guys probably already know him from 2 volumes, right? You wrote, I was telling the crew, like you wrote the book on virtual production, volume 1 and volume 2, which is pretty awesome. And so we're going to talk today about game arts, virtual production. I want to talk to you about writing and the creative process, if you're willing to go there, and then also just get into some of the stuff that you wrote in the book itself. And let me move this so I can see. No.
Do you have a camera feed on your side? I just see Vertex School text, but
you do?
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's what I see.
Oh yeah, you do. And it's because. But let me see if I can start video for you so that we can look in each other's eyes.
Oh, there you go. Okay, wow. Yeah.
All right.
In the dark there. Nice.
Okay. All right, so I just got to make sure I am looking at the right place. If I go there, that's no good. Sorry, folks. Just still getting the studio all set up. And I want to make sure I'm looking like at you virtually, not away from you virtually. You ever see those webinars where it's like one person's looking that way and they're all mixed up. So again, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time. And so I think I'd love to start this with you just telling us a little bit about yourself, because I looked you up and I saw the work you did. I read through it. It's like it just blew my mind. But then I'm looking up what you do, and there's cinematographer, there's writer, and there's a bunch of stuff. So do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Oh yeah, I mean the main thing these days is writing. Doing a lot of stuff about virtual production and kind of all that it implies. I've been a writer at American Cinematographer magazine for about 15 years now. I just started doing the job of the virtual production editor, which basically just means I'm kind of looking at all things virtual production.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. I run the Virtual Production Podcast, which is available on anywhere you can listen to podcasts as well. And I wrote these 2 volumes so far of the Virtual Production Field Guide for Epic Games, or the makers of Unreal Engine and Fortnite and a lot of other cool stuff. And,
yeah.
Yeah.
What got you into virtual production?
Well, let's see. I was introduced to it formally about 3 years ago when I got hired to do a story about Technicolor Film Labs in LA was doing some experiments with it, and they were essentially doing live motion capture where they were taking cameras but they weren't film cameras. They were like just capturing motion only, and they were capturing actors in motion capture suits, and they were doing it in front of an LED wall. That LED wall was not quite good enough to look realistic on camera, but I could kind of see where it was going.
Yeah.
And so, that got my interest, and, just seeing where it's gone ever since then. I mean, I think The Mandalorian was kind of the thing that sort of brought it all into the mainstream of what had been happening for a few years before that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then this has been a large part of your life for the last couple of years, yeah? I mean, these volumes don't look like they happened very fast.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because these things seem like they're just come out of nowhere, but yeah, there's been a lot of people working in this stuff kind of in development for a while. And, now that, I want to say 2 years ago, there were maybe 8 or 9 of these production capable stages in the world that could shoot something that looked like The Mandalorian, where they were, basically filming visual effects live in front of a giant screen.
Yeah.
Now I'm building a map for the next issue of American Cinematographer, and we're tracking like over 120 of major ones in the world.
Wow.
And probably a lot more than that in sort of experimental, exploratory, or planned sort of phases. So yeah, it's quickly becoming a pretty big thing, and I think it's been very fueled by the pandemic because it sort of solves a lot of the major issues of restriction of crew size and of travel and wanting to go to locations but being kind of constrained. So that kind of supercharged what was happening already and sort of pushed a lot of productions that might not have gone into it much quicker. So
yeah.
It's been just kind of exploding really over the past year.
So virtual production, as I'm reading through your volumes, and including what was mentioned about the third volume, virtual production is, it's kind of a vast field. So most people, as you said, know it through The Mandalorian. And in The Mandalorian, we know it from the behind the scenes where people are basically in the volume. And, I imagine that's what you're referring to as a production ready, space for virtual production, right?
Yeah. It really, as a term, that's one of the things that's why I was actually hired to write those books in the first place, was to kind of help define, what exactly virtual production is, because it is a bit of an all-encompassing term. I mean, we sort of came down on it's anywhere where virtual elements and the physical world intersect. So, if you're doing a movie where you have digital characters that are meant to interact with physical characters in the same scene, and the computer is helping you kind of visualize that, then that's virtual production. So the first movie that kind of coined the term was Avatar back in 2009, where they had digital characters and digital camera movement sort of being used to make a live action animated film, where it looked like it was live action, but it was all captured, using digital means without actually being photographed. So, some other forms of it are a lot of visualization is falls under that same, like we talk about things like pre-visualization, where you're using the computer to kind of make animated storyboards to show what, an action sequence or a big visual effects sequence might look like.
Right.
And what's kind of cool is that all of that now with real-time animation tools has made it possible to make the imagery look a lot closer to the final version and be able to be manipulated in real time, versus previs of 5-6 years ago was very kind of proxy and low res and required a lot of sort of finessing and back and forth, and it wasn't particularly interactive. It was more just like, this is a storyboard of how it could look, but it doesn't really look much like the final imagery because it's being done as quickly as possible and not very realistic. Whereas now you can get what would have looked like realistic final animation kind of just right out of the box with real-time tools. So it's changed that as well.
Yeah. And I'm, with the new Unreal, like we've been playing with Lumen and Nanite and all of that, and the obviously the software is elevating up dramatically. But what are when we're thinking about virtual production, my angle on this, the thing that's relevant to me is students and training for it, and people getting jobs. And so one of our students recently, Andrew, got a job at Pixmondo. And his job there, ostensibly was Star Trek Discovery, come on, help them kind of do this within a virtual production environment. And so he got on there and his job eventually kind of moved into tool building and other things. You can't quite tell me the whole, everything that they do there. But what is kind of really relevant for me right now is kind of unpacking, like, where's the jobs? What do the jobs entail? How does somebody start to understand what this is in terms of the prep work? And then the other thing that we kind of specialize here, like our focus here at Vertex, we're not focused on a traditional education pipeline that might say take somebody from modeling to this to that. We look at acceleration. And, that's all fine. That sounds all marketing. But the general idea is to find out what are the hiring triggers, or the skills that are required, and just find a way to map those faster. So I always ask people what the hiring triggers are. And we may not know what those are right now, especially in this field, but that's kind of on my mind. So why don't we start with this first thing of what are the common jobs and the common ways that people end up working in this field?
Well, if we're talking, Star Trek is a great example because up until the most current season, they were a much more traditional visual effects pipeline where everything was blue screen, everything was post composited, everything was, rendered in post. Whereas, and again, partially fueled by the pandemic and a desire to condense or avoid location shooting, they really leaned into virtual production, and they ended up shooting both the season 4 of Star Trek Discovery and season 1 of Star Trek Strange New World, which is their newest show, sharing the same very large screen in Toronto, and doing. I spoke to them briefly about it a couple of months ago, and basically they're doing most of what would have been location photography, using this stage, and also some stuff that would have been blue screen. They're still doing some blue screen as well, so there's a mix. But it's very quickly become something that they are, not going to stop doing.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as where the jobs are, it's basically people who have some experience in traditional production, traditional workflows, but who understand the real-time tools. And the interesting thing to me is there is such a lack of people who have that combination. It's probably easier right now if you were to come to a production and say, I know how to do production, but I also am I'm very experienced in Unreal Engine and as well as maybe Maya or 3D Studio.
Yeah.
And I've had some set experience. It's a lot easier to get a job with that kind of background than than anything else. Than just being more traditional animator, just because there's so much demand all of a sudden.
Yeah, we're seeing that too, especially in what they call an Unreal Engine generalist. But that's just another way of saying we don't have a word for it right now. It's like you can just do everything because we don't know where we're going to put you.
Yeah.
So where are the jobs now? We talked a little bit about the skill and the mapping this, and one of the things that was interesting in your document was this idea of virtual scouting, and that kind of struck me because in a linear pipeline, you usually have the concept and then you have the build, and there's carpentry, you don't do that on the fly, so that's planned out, and then they go into production. But then there's this idea that there's actual artists just building stuff, and from there you're actually scouting locations and scenes and things of that nature. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the stuff you've learned there in terms of virtual scouting, kind of how different productions use that?
Yeah. So I mean, in its most pure form, virtual scouting is when you're using some form of CG animation to kind of explore a potential environment. Traditional scouting is you literally like, oh, we're going to film at this basketball court tomorrow. Let's just go check it out today and sort of see what the angles are, how the light looks, and just kind of get familiar with it. Whereas in virtual scouting, you're doing the same thing, but it's you're literally looking at a completely digital environment. And that used to be of kind of limited use because whatever the environment you might have been looking at would be just a proxy, and the reality is so different. Up until recently, I know in speaking to a lot of filmmakers that they were kind of had a real sort of hate relationship with previs because most of the stuff that was depicted in the previs just had very little resemblance to what was happening on the set, and oftentimes was impossible to pull off because in the previous tools there wasn't a physical camera. There, the optics or the physics of the way a shot looked in previs just wasn't possible to get in the real world. So, it was kind of counterproductive. Whereas now, because the tools are incorporating real world physics and real world cinema optics and things like that, and also using the same assets that are going to end up being in the final shots, it suddenly becomes a lot more useful to spend time in that digital, that virtual scouting phase. And for example, a show like The Mandalorian, they take that to a pretty significant level. They don't ever bother to get on the actual shooting phase until they've made the entire show in virtual scouting. They'll bring the director and the cinematographer, the actors, and they'll literally shoot every shot in the show and edit it and basically make a version of the episode completely in digital tools and use that then as the blueprint for what they're going to shoot when they go, to the physical set. So, that aspect of filmmaking has suddenly become much more hands-on and useful than it might have been a few years back, just because what's possible in the tools is so much more interactive and closer to how things would look in the final version. So it's just become more interesting and more relevant to filmmakers.
That's fascinating. Okay, so what are the I know the question I get from a lot of students right now that are looking at this is like, I hear this, I understand this stuff sounds really cool, and it's really cool that we're hearing from Jon Favreau and all of this, but I still don't know, like, what do the jobs, like, how does it unpack into a job? So of course, let's go show up, let's go, and I'm gonna work on my Unreal Engine experience, but like in my case of my student, he was an environment artist, crazy talented, and he'd actually built a Borg cube and a bunch of other kind of stuff related to Star Trek, and that got their attention. He shows up, and then next thing you know, he's doing tool building. So if you can you tell me a little bit about like the actual jobs that people end up doing? So in virtual scouting, does that mean somebody, like, there's an artist that's going around actually like putting mega scans around all over the place, or what information can you share there?
Yeah, I mean, it really does kind of depends. I mean, ultimately, what needs to happen in these kinds of setups, if you're building if you're building an LED wall that has to interact with the real world, it's a lot of environmental development. And again, because the tool, it's interesting because even a year ago, part of that whole process was making sure that the assets that you were building weren't too complicated, because they would overwhelm the engine when it's one thing when if you're doing shots in Maya and you have a particularly complicated but nice looking model, maybe you don't really care that much, because if it takes an extra hour to render a frame, you'll just deal with it. You'll fire it into the render farm and you'll worry about it the next day. But when you need to capture 24 frames a second live, you got to watch out for performance on your models. And so up until a year ago, that was part of the job, was making sure that you didn't overwhelm the system. But now, as you know, in the latest version of Unreal, they've kind of sort of figured out a way to completely push past that to where there is no limitation. Like this engine just continually sort of virtualizes your triangles down to the point where you have something that it's like impossible to overwhelm it with too complex of a model. It just scales it live, but makes it visually look as complicated as you need it to be, which is, seems to me like kind of the holy grail and all this stuff.
Totally.
So ultimately, the job of making an efficient model just went away, but the job of just making content that works in the engine is still there. So, I mean, I think people who come from any kind of artistic background, who would have been, animators or riggers or environmental, look dev people, all those people have a place in these productions.
Look dev, yeah.
And then some, because there's just so, it's not just one spaceship model that's going to be composited onto a blue screen shot. It's like the entire, backdrop and maybe part of the ship itself that is all being captured live, and the camera has got to be, ready to go. And maybe there's a little bit of a difference in that the traditional sort of animator role is somebody who maybe is not so used to being in a, live production environment. They might be a little more accustomed to kind of just one man banding it or one person banding it in like a room somewhere, just chugging away on their work and then finishing their own shots. Whereas this is more of a, live. I think there's a bit of a discipline to that too, is finding the person who's capable of performing that job, but also functioning in a production environment where there's more pressure and there's more people coming at you with requests that need to be answered, on the spot and not kind of figured out as you go.
Yeah, I get that. And so we talk here at Vertex a lot about I'm no innovator in this kind of concept, but I'm always preparing my students and myself for the future. I have this background where I helped build this program called ZBrush, and I saw ZBrush destroy sculpting jobs. Like people I knew and I went to school with, and they were like die-hard sculptors and hands-in clay kind of people, right? And I remember the story with Steve Lord, one of my teachers, where he said that the studio came and they said, "Hey, everybody needs to learn ZBrush," and they're all like, "No, man, we love clay, we're wax, we're gonna do this. You can't replicate all this stuff." Steve's the only guy that learned ZBrush, and at the end of that year, they let the entire team go, and
Sure.
Steve did all of their work by himself, and I'm looking at technology, and so I know technology. I have practical experience with people being jobless from this. So we talk about two things. We talk about technical creativity and computational creativity. Talking about how the technically creative jobs that they do right now are always going to move into computational. That's just their natural evolution. So if your job is low resolution stuff, like you can make optimized stuff inside of Maya, right? So this gets to the topic you were talking about, where the job used to be optimization, and now we don't know. Like somebody's got to push that and find out if it even matters. So these jobs start to transition, and the low polygon is like those. I mean, that went out to outsourcing. Now I think it just went out the window. So when we look at the jobs for artists in the future, and you've been working with Epic, and you've been looking at this from a film, I just wonder, like, what do you see as essential creative skills for creatives? Yeah. I mean, I'll leave you there and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was up until there was kind of a division of digital artists between feature and TV and then game development, and those were pretty. I think those used to split pretty down the line, and there wasn't a ton of crossover because they had completely different requirements. It's like game stuff is much more about performance and optimization, and playback in real time, whereas film and TV is more like realistic image quality, and per frame rendering is not really so much a concern. It's just like a final image quality.
Right.
And now I think those things are coming together. I mean, what I've heard from and speaking to a lot of folks, I've interviewed a bunch of people from like ILM and Digital Domain, which are I think still sort of the leaders in the sense of they're doing the biggest projects. And they're all saying the same thing, that they're seeing a lot of people who used to be just video games or used to be just features kind of sort of straddling the line now, because the tools that are being used to create, I mean, it's like, The Mandalorian is entirely created in game engine technology. It's using a lot of assets that might have been generated in more traditional, visual effects tools.
Yeah.
But what actually is powering what you see behind the camera, in front of the camera on the walls that they're filming on, is game engine tech. And so, I think you could not hurt yourself right now by learning Unreal Engine, at least
Right.
in some fashion.
Yeah.
Just to be able to get into a conversation of having experience with it. I honestly think there's going to be a moment where, much like in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of visual effects houses that were traditional optical houses that knew how to do miniatures, they knew how to do optical compositing, and then CG and digital compositing came along, and many of those companies adapted and became CG and digital compositing experts, and the ones that didn't just disappeared. And I think the same thing is going to happen very soon, and is happening already, that you're going to see visual effects houses today, the ones that are going to stay, that are like, we're only going to do Maya, we're only going to do 3D Studio, we're only going to do Houdini, like we don't care about game engine, they're going to go away, because more and more jobs will come up that the companies that are leaning into that, who can say, oh, sure, you want to do 5 versions of this shot like in 3 minutes? Sure, we can do that. Versus like, give us till tomorrow. I mean, it's just, there isn't going to be a competition very long as more and more producers come to realize that's basically the difference in value proposition, that they can see shots instantly and they can change them instantly versus, give us some time to re-render. That competitive advantage is just too strong for things to stay the way they are. So, having a background in that, and not to say that learning Maya, that learning ZBrush is still absolutely valid, but being able to say, and I know how to use that in a game engine setting as well, is going to really be what I think is going to keep people working as they go along.
That makes a lot of sense. And now you come from a cinematography background, and that's the where that's kind of the your writing, all of that stuff. And one of the things that we talk about here, and all the artists that I've interviewed, they all talk about story. And they all talk like when you're creating work at this point, it's not necessarily the tools. It's, can you tell the story? Can you start to make something believable, but then also relatable? And this comes to like a simple prop. If you're going to do a fire extinguisher, where's that bin? Like we're not hiring you to just make some random fire extinguisher we could get from Turbo Squid. We want this thing that's been in this environment. It's lived here. It's going to sit in the corner. It needs to be done and look good. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand lighting, how to position the camera, and what are essentially cinematic elements. So what it would help me and some of my crew if we could talk for a second about cinematography and just like some of the essential things that make this great, that are finding their way over into this new CG world, right? Because I know Unreal spent time dealing with lensing and getting that programmed, and so that that's obviously higher level than I would quite comprehend in terms of how the glass affects and things like that. But there is things like understanding lighting. And I kind of think, and this is one of the things where I was really super excited to chat with you, is, if an artist comes into this area now and they've modeled, they've done all their basics, they've done, that stuff, but they also build it in a way that's beautiful. It's lit. Like that's what's starting to attract attention now. It has been for a while, but it used to be much harder. So can you tell me a little bit about cinematography? So like, how do you define it? And then I'll want to get in and see if we can understand some of the principles that really help somebody focus their work.
Yeah, I mean, So I've been writing for American Cinematographer for over 15 years now, and up until recently, most of my work was more focused in traditional kind of movies. Movies that typically had some visual effects aspects to them, but were not being filmed in LED volumes. And that is changing a lot of how these things are approached, because a traditional cinematographer, like a world-class, like talented cinematographer, they really understand everything about how to communicate something visually. Mm-hmm. What the choice of optics, the choice of lighting instruments, the choice of colors, the choice of particular props, how that all kind of communicates the intent of the story. And now the tools are starting to really incorporate that. 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't much, because Unreal was basically, game engine and wasn't really being used in telling, in doing visual effects for movies. There was just like kind of a standard POV. And then they started like, okay, well, why don't we start adding in like aspect ratios? Why don't we start adding in like, this is how this kind of camera system sees something. Let's start adding in optics, let's add in real lens equivalents and real apertures, because we can then simulate how things look if something has a very close focus or something is very deep focus. And all of that, when it's like maybe an audience doesn't quite understand what they're looking at, but they're being communicated on a level that does make a difference.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think you can not study enough traditional cinematography, and the more you kind of understand how things like optics affect it and lighting, the more useful you can be. Because Yeah, I personally think the tools themselves are not that hard to learn anymore. You know, they're pretty intuitive. There's tons of really good tutorials out there, but no having enough of an artistic, experienced eye to be able to look at something and say it doesn't look realistic because the lighting is not quite right because of this, or the lens looks wrong because it's focused in this way that doesn't really exist in life. Having that ability is, I think, what was going to help people stand apart, because they will end up with reels that just look more, realistic. I mean, it's a very, it may not be the easiest thing to kind of quantify when you look at a person's reel, but I think the people who are hiring these jobs, if one person has a very solid background in traditional cinematography and action blocking and um, visual storytelling versus another person who just purely learned how to animate, I think that one will very much stand out as just somehow better because it'll just feel more real and coming from a place of someone who understands these things. So yeah, I mean, studying those traditional ways things are done is really key.
What's the pitch though? Like, what's the pain? So, if we get into cinematography, like if I was to tell one of my students, like, hey, you gotta go study cinematography, they'd be like, well, okay, you go get the books. And the books are going to be all the cinematographers, and you're going to start breaking things down. But when we look at this from a visual perspective, because I think, as you were saying, it's really about communicating visually. And that's kind of seems to be anyways, one of the primary jobs of cinematographer is just to get that lens, to get everything in there so that it's visually communicating what the director had in mind. But in a lot of ways, what are the elements? So they're paying attention to lighting. What makes good lighting, and what are the elements that we need to start to look at? And maybe what we could do, because I know that I'm asking a vague question, and I don't like to ask vague questions, because I hate it when they ask me that, is there a cinematographer that you think really has done, that you admire? Let's just start there. That you think kind of connects with this whole movement into virtual production?
I mean, that it's interesting because I'm actually helping folks at the ASC, which is the American Society of Cinematographers. It's sort of like the professional guild for and ironically, it's not limited to Americans only. It's limited. It's meant to be like the top tier, and it's the administration of it is out of the United States, but they have quite an international roster. But I'm helping those folks kind of start to work in this area because they obviously bring a lot of really good traditional experience and skills, and translating that into such a it's really I think what it comes down to more than anything is being able to communicate a common language. That was kind of the point of those virtual production field guides as well, because the way an animator thinks about lights in a scene and the way a cinematographer, completely different.
Right.
I mean, you talk to the average cinematographer, they're going to talk about specific brands and wattage and amperage and bulb type and and diffusion in front of that light. And when you talk to an animator, they're going to be talking about a spotlight, an area light, a sky dome. But it's completely, it's night and day. But having the ability to figure out that common ground. I mean, I wouldn't even name a particular cinematographer just for not wanting to be a favorite. But looking at our magazine, even online, there's a ton of really good information and a lot of really good examples. I mean, just watching movies more than anything. But then going in and sort of seeing how some of them are made, because they're typically that good cinematography doesn't draw attention to itself, other than it just seems like it's giving the right mood for something. But it's extremely deeply constructed, in terms of how it's shot, how it's color graded, how it's edited. All those things are being very carefully thought out by good cinematographers. So learning at least even the slightest bit of that art, I think, is useful.
Okay, so I'm gonna drill down just a little bit further, see if I can, and then we'll switch. But if we go back to the idea of hiring triggers, the people I work with, they don't know what they don't know, which is basically all of us. But especially when you're starting out, right, you just don't know what you don't know. So you might create a piece of work and you're like, this is great, I did something amazing. You show it to your mom, and your mom's like, well, depending on your mom, if it's my mom, she'll be like, well, and you're missing this, and she can see it, right? But you can't as the creative. So when we're looking at this, in your experience and all the time you've been doing this in cinematography and working this, like what are some of the things that you would say are really important for CG artists, basically, to start putting into their work? Things that you think they're just not putting in. And the way I like to do it is we look for the hiring trigger. So we look for the thing. So it's like, all right, is this lit well? Okay, but in your light, did you add that diffusion of the fog and the atmosphere so that the light actually is responding to something? And working from there, is there any kind of levels you can kind of give us there?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of shot selection. Like, it's funny, I was just playing I was playing a Grand Theft Auto game yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's one of those games that has a ton of little cutscenes in it. And I was noticing, like, the cutscenes are kind of lame because they're all shot from almost the same angle at almost the same, like, frame size. And so it really feels more like you're watching, like, TV news coverage of a scene than like a nice. I mean, I think they got better with those as they went along, and they started to vary. And this was I think this was like maybe a 10-year-old game, but studying how films are put together, they're shot. The films are made sort of shot by shot. It's very rare for a movie to stay on the same lens and the same camera height and the same distance to the subject shot after shot. Whereas if you're used to playing a video game like a third-person shooter, first-person shooter, everything is from one perspective, and it's rare to see the height of the camera move much unless you're crouching down or whatever, or jumping out of a plane or whatever. But it's like everything kind of sort of comes at this sort of like human height perspective and shot size. So, I think right off the bat, just thinking a little bit of like, oh, I'm going to cut from a very wide overhead angle shot of this scene to a super tight close-up on some detail from it. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to completely, I'm going to move some lighting source through the scene that's going to change where I'm focusing. That kind of stuff is the things that you would just take for granted in a regular movie. But that can really add something because they just make things look directed. It just doesn't look like I just plunked down the default camera in the middle of the scene and I'm just kind of cutting around to get whatever I feel like seeing.
Yeah,
versus like I'm shooting this shot by shot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. I could that's instantly going to make it into the curriculum, because. Thank you. Because as when you're creating something, you just kind of focus on, all right, I'm done. I went through this hurdle. I went through that hurdle. I got all this stuff. I'm like, and you don't think of it like an artist. When you develop mastery, you're kind of thinking about that 5%. That takes more. So how long have you been a writer?
Oh well, let's see. I want to say. I mean. I think I started writing for the magazine like in 2005 or so, but I've been doing I don't know, I do a lot of little marketing stuff and things like that. I mean, it's more, it's easy when you find the stuff personally interesting, and it sometimes takes me places. Like I managed to get to quite a few film sets to just talk to the filmmakers, because this particular magazine happens to have a lot of interest among the people who are doing this stuff. I guess it's like it's that the society itself has been around for like 100 years, so it's pretty.
Oh wow!
It's pretty well ensconced in the biz.
Yeah.
So before that, it's fun for me because I used to read that magazine. It's one of the few magazines that would come to because I lived in New Mexico growing up, and it's one of the few magazines I would find regularly on the newsstand about movie making that I could understand, because it was all about camera work. So, I guess I was a fan of it long before I was a writer for it. And, it's been great. I mean, it's interesting. I think people who are cinematographers really again, not to put anybody down, but I think they put as much or as much thought as anybody on the crew into how they're filming stuff, because they kind of have to be the sort of go between of they on the one hand they know all the technical stuff about what camera they're using and how it's going to be treated and what lens and what lighting is going to be set up, but they also have to understand the script as well or better than the director, so that they can communicate the story visually, because the director's going to say, oh, I want this scene to be scary, and then you deal with it, and the cinematographer is the one that's got to be like, okay, that means I'm going to put the lighting down to this level, I'm going to change the colors, I'm going to go on this very tight lens, all those decisions that enhance that mood. So I mean, yeah, if you can be an animator or a rigger or a environmental artist that takes any of that stuff into account, I think you'll just magically be more talented, just because you'll bring more to the table than you would just pressing the buttons and making the stuff go, because it's getting, that part I think is getting easier and easier than ever. I mean, I've been dabbling in Unreal, and I'm by no means any sort of trained animator, but I can make stuff that looks pretty good. So I would imagine somebody that's got some actual training and skill in this stuff, and also a little bit of familiarity with the artistic side of it, could really go to town. I mean, and I know that just looking at LinkedIn, I see people get jobs just literally like, here's a work in progress from something I'm doing for a student project, and then it's like, so some head of production at Amazon's like, give me a call. It's just like, it just happens.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Okay, so I kind of want to get, if you don't mind, can I ask you about writing? A few more things, because I have a book I have not written for freaking ever that I have wanted to write forever about being an artist in the creative process. It's called The Rules of Fire, the Ecosystem. We'll deal with that later.
Cool. Cool.
So do you have a process for writing?
Yeah. The most important thing for me to writing is just like to just start. Like, I mean, I can honestly say there's not been a single thing I've ever written where I didn't look at a blank piece of paper and say I'm a complete fraud. I have no idea what I'm doing. This is never going to work. And then somehow magically, like a week later, I've got this brilliant sounding piece of text that somehow came together. So the only way it ever seems to work for me is to just, I mean, I've set myself a 30-minute timer. I just go like, I'm just going to write stuff out for 30 minutes, and whatever I come up with, I'm just going to, that's just going to be part of the article or whatever I'm writing. And that seems to work. It's very hard. Well, sounds like, as you know, it's very hard to just start, because you're always thinking, oh, I want it to be perfect. And I've never written anything. There's never anything I've ever written that was exactly word for word what I typed out in the first go. I mean, I'm always constantly going back and forth and changing and updating and switching stuff around, or, adding new stuff or whatever. And so just getting it going, I think, is the hardest part, because it's, you have the ability to re-edit as you go. So, I mean, that makes it, I mean, I'm much happy to be a writer than, say, like somebody who has to perform live on a stage, because that feels like you got to just nail it and be perfect at it every second. Whereas writing, you have so much opportunity to refine it as you go. There's no reason not to just kind of get it out there and get it going.
And when you're working on a project like this, it's technical. There's a lot of information. You've got to gather like a bunch of different stuff. So you did a ton of interviews with people. John Favreau, you did like great stuff. So when you're gathering all this together and kind of piecing this big project, because it's a huge project, it's almost 200 pages, I think, or is it 200 pages? It's right there.
Something like that. Yeah, it's up there.
How do you organize all of that? How does somebody kind of gather it all together?
Oh, yeah. I mean, outlining is really the key for me. I don't. I would say that, like, I spent probably 75% of the time writing that last virtual production field guide was making the outline. The outline itself was, I want to say, 15 pages, and each little entry in the outline was, a page or two of the final book. But it's like I didn't want to even start any actual, because I think it's, you wouldn't. I mean, when you're finally writing, you're not. It's rare to write from the first page to the last page in order. It's more like you're sort of filling in little tiles on a mosaic. And if you don't have the whole structure of how it's going, it's like, I mean, you wouldn't build a skyscraper by like starting on the 15th floor and kind of working your way out. I mean, you need to know exactly where you're going from start to finish to be able to build that structure up. So, um, you know, I find like I use Google Docs. I used to do everything in Word or in Pages or whatever, but I've lately been just using Google Docs, and I find that it has like nice, decent like built-in outlining tools, and because the project like this, there was a lot of collaborators. I had a couple people from Epic who were not writing, but they were like going along with me and making sure I was hitting all the points we wanted to cover.
Right.
And then a lot of people were reviewing it and being able to only have one version to refer to. I mean, it's probably the same I imagine in animation. If you don't have some sort of version control, it can become extremely frustrating just trying to harmonize all the different versions when people want to give feedback on something. So, doing that, I mean, that just spending the time to sort of create the architecture up front, I think pays off a lot, because it's a lot easier when you're writing to go back to that outline and be like, oh yeah, what's the next part after this? Oh yeah, of course. Versus like, well, I don't know, let's just see where it goes. I mean, it's hard.
Yeah. I find writing, I like to, there's a book I like to recommend my students called The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield. Are you familiar with that one? It's pretty amazing. I'll have to send you a link. And
I'll look that up.
The basic idea, at least the thing that interests me about writing is that it's such a pure form, because we think in words and we write in words. So in terms of an art form, it's like super pure. It's not like you're translating it into some 3D model or some piece of clay. It's like the words are the art. So the creative process is really prevalent. It's very, right then and there. Do you find that there's a certain amount of time you can work per day on writing? Do you find that there's a like a point of diminishing returns, for it? Do you need to just push through, or how do you take care of yourself so you're actually able to meet deadlines in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is not taking on so much work that I'm gonna. I mean, I've had occasional situations where I've had multiple things due around the same time, and that becomes hard. But it's I'll just literally be like, okay, I'm gonna time myself and spend 1 hour on this thing, and then I'm gonna stop and take a break, and then I'm gonna spend 1 hour on this thing, and slowly build them up. But yeah, I mean, I feel like. Normally I get enough time to not have to, as long as I don't completely procrastinate, to be able to get it done well. I mean, I think not doing anything to the last moment that it's due is definitely always a bad idea. But, taking the time to start, I mean, I think that's probably what I do a lot of, is just I start outlining almost immediately. I write kind of what I mean, since a lot of these pieces do rely on what people say in interviews.
Yeah.
I'll kind of write what I think might come of a particular interview and how that would fit in the overall, like I'll start with some random thesis of like what this movie is about and what I think the people are going to talk about, and either as I go quotes will fit or not, and then just going to take it from there, but also be open to going off in whatever direction these subjects take it in. It's like it's to me it's like most of the stuff I write, like the people who are speaking, their quotes kind of form the bulk of the story, and I'm just writing kind of introductions and weaving the context in and out of each quote. So being enough of a listener to know when to sort of spot when someone said something that I think will be relevant to the story, and marking that for later. Plus the tools are getting really good. Like I use this thing called Descript now. This is sort of like an app, but it's also a website.
Yeah.
And it does a really good job of transcripting everything that gets, like I said, I record an interview with somebody. It does a really good job transcribing everything. And then you can edit audio, but you're editing text in it, but you're cutting audio. I mean, I use it on my podcast too, to be honest. And it's just a great tool. Cause when I first started doing interviews, I would literally just take notes. I wouldn't even bother to record the audio portion. I would just take notes and kind of reconstruct what the person had said based on my notes, and that was hard. And it's gotten a lot easier with the ability to just record stuff digitally and get instant transcriptions, and that's made my life a lot more fun because it's like more just pure creativity and less nitty gritty.
And you're a creative who's, writes, interviews creatives at the highest level. And have you picked up any tips on like how to do this? I don't want to say successfully because I'm not thinking money, but like how you do this well. Like, what's a quote unquote successful creative do?
I mean, I guess one thing is sort of knowing the style you're aiming for. To be honest, the first time I ever wrote for American Cinematographer was I had made my own little movie, like as a student filmmaker, and I really was like, I had this dream. I was like, I love this magazine. It would be so awesome if they would write about my movie, I kept like bugging the editor, who I happened to have his email, and he would just be like, why would we cover your random student film? And I'm like, it's newsworthy. We use this brand new camera from Panasonic that's never been used before in a film, and it would be great. And finally he's like, look, I have very little interest in doing this as a story. I don't feel like paying for it. You are welcome to write your own version of this story. If it's any good, I'll consider printing it. And so I was like, yes, I'll do that. And so I was like, this is perfect. I've read this magazine for years. I know exactly the style of how these articles are written. I interviewed myself. I made it sound exact. I was like, I spent days and days and days making it sound to me exactly like one of their articles.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they took it and they're like, okay, we'll print it.
Well,
and then like from there, they're like, you did a pretty good job on your own movie. Do you think you could talk about someone else's movie? I'm like, sure. So, that's a very long-winded way of saying, if you want to write for a particular publication or type of, particular magazine, newspaper, whatever, online site, just know their style and study it and be able to write in their voice.
Yeah, we talk about that. We actually ask our students to find their North Star. So know what studio you want. You know that from the beginning. You don't go over to Blizzard, come back over to Naughty Dog, and these are different worlds. So, all right, we're coming up on time. So, you've worked with Epic for a while. What is in the future? Like, these guys are building. Like, what the hell is going on here? You got to have help us out here. I got to know what's going on.
Well, it's like I think it's just one of those big watershed moments that a tool is really leading a revolution. Like I think. In the mid 80s and 90s, there was a big desktop revolution. There was a big digital editing revolution, digital image editing revolution led by like Photoshop and PageMaker. And then, in the 2000s, video editing became suddenly very in reach thanks to tools like Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere.
That's
and
context.
It just, and it just feels like that's what is happening with this tool, that it's very quickly morphing from a tool used to make video games to a tool used to just make any kind of content you want. And they're really swinging for the fences. They have a ton of people they've brought in over the years who are coming from a traditional visual effects background. Like the person I work with most closely at Epic was like the head of publicity for Lucasfilm and ILM for 20 years.
Wow.
So he knows everything. He knows a ton about visual effects, traditional visual effects. He knows everybody in the business. And, it's like they're knowing that they're plugging in super smart, super experienced people like that just tells me they're really swinging for the fences, and, they want to be the tool. I don't think their goal is a monopoly, but I just don't think I don't see any other company trying to be that one sort of like linchpin of what is quickly becoming a very popular method of filmmaking that, is not, when you look at something like The Mandalorian and how that was produced and the quality they were able to achieve completely in camera, it's like there's no way that genie's ever going back in the bottle. Like everybody wants to be able to make something like that.
Yeah.
And knowing these are the tools and the people who are doing it, it just seems like it's a no-brainer to me to hitch, at least some part of your wagon to that and at least play with that tool enough to be familiar with it and be able to say, sure, I could work with that tool.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't hurt.
Yeah, definitely. And I know from my own experience, like when I helped develop ZBrush, that everything I have in life is because I was on that wave, and I caught it early. And so, I mean, it seems like it's still early, and it only seems like it's early because it seems like they have a vision that like nobody's quite seen that entire thing yet. So we know it's still building. So, Noah, thanks
Yeah.
for
No, and
yeah.
yeah, no, it's exactly that. There is a huge opportunity, and there's, people are getting into it, but it's still very early days. So, there's, and I think it's a welcoming subset of the biz. Just, there's a lot of people that are doing this that are interested in sort of forming community and sort of figuring stuff out because it's interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking your time, part of your day here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, sure, my pleasure. All right, cool. Good to talk to you.
Great to meet you. And so, you ever come out to Austin?
No, I would love to though. I used to live in Texas, so I used to come out. I used to travel to Austin quite a bit, but I'm guessing it changed quite a bit since the '90s. But
Yeah, it's changed quite a bit in the last year. So many people are moving here. It's crazy.
that's what I hear. Yeah, I know. I should just follow everybody that left San Francisco to go to Austin. I know we lost a few over there. Maybe I'll do the same. But
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time.
all right, sounds good. Take care.
All right. Take care.